What does an innocent person look like? Do they look like you? Your neighbor? Your friend? Since 1989 in the United States, we know what at least 375 of them look like. They are the people who have been exonerated by DNA evidence after being wrongfully convicted. Collectively, they served over 5,200 years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. That's thousands of years stolen. Thousands of lives derailed. But this isn't a story about statistics. This is a story about people. We're all taught to believe in justice. That the scales are balanced, the truth will prevail, and the guilty get punished. But what happens when the system gets it profoundly wrong? What happens when an innocent person is swallowed whole by that system, their pleas for help just lost in the machinery of law and order? For decades, these were nightmares with no waking up. A life sentence meant a life sentence. But then came a revolution. Not in a courtroom or a Capitol building, but in a laboratory. A revolution hiding in the microscopic strands of our own DNA. This single scientific breakthrough has become one of the most powerful tools for justice we've ever seen, able to reach back in time and right the most terrible of wrongs. Tonight, we bring you 5 of those stories. 5 lives changed forever by a flawed system. 5 people who spent years, even decades, trapped in a nightmare. And the one scientific key that finally set them free. Our first story kicks off in 1984, in Burlington, North Carolina. A 22-year-old college student, Jennifer Thompson, was asleep in her apartment when a man broke in and sexually assaulted her. During the horrific attack, she made a conscious, determined choice to memorize every single detail of her attacker's face. She promised herself that if she survived, she would make sure he was brought to justice. When police showed her a photo lineup, she identified a 22-year-old man named Ronald Cotton. Later, in a physical lineup, she confirmed her choice. In court, she pointed at him and said with absolute certainty, "That's the one." Her testimony was powerful, it was convincing, and it was utterly devastating. For the jury, it was the most compelling evidence imaginable. Despite Ronald Cotton's insistence that he was innocent and an alibi that was mistakenly disproven, Jennifer's eyewitness account was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. This is the single greatest cause of wrongful convictions in the United States: eyewitness misidentification. It plays a role in roughly 70% of all cases later overturned through DNA evidence. The human mind just isn't a video recorder. Stress, bad lighting, and the intense trauma of a crime can profoundly warp our memory. For years, Ronald Cotton fought his conviction from behind bars. He filed appeal after appeal, and every single one was denied. Hope was dwindling. But his new lawyers didn't give up. They filed a motion to have the biological evidence from the crime scene, semen samples, tested using a new technology, DNA analysis. In the spring of 1995, the results came in. The DNA from the crime scene did not belong to Ronald Cotton. It was a complete exclusion. The system had convicted an innocent man. But the story doesn't stop there. At the defense's request, the state ran the crime scene DNA profile through its database of convicted felons. They got a hit. The DNA belonged to a man named Bobby Poole, a serial offender who had even bragged to another inmate about committing the very crime Ronald was in prison for. In an almost unbelievable twist, Jennifer Thompson had actually seen Bobby Poole before. During Cotton's second trial, prosecutors brought Poole into the courtroom to show he didn't look like Cotton. When asked if she'd ever seen him, Jennifer testified that she hadn't. Her memory, so certain and so powerful, had failed her. On June 30, 1995, after serving 10.5 years, Ronald Cotton walked out of prison a free man. Science didn't just prove his innocence, it found the real perpetrator. In an incredible act of grace, Cotton would later meet and forgive Jennifer Thompson, and together they became powerful advocates for criminal justice reform, working to ensure their shared trauma could prevent future tragedies. Imagine being interrogated for hours on end. You're exhausted, scared, confused. The police tell you that you're looking at the death penalty. But if you just tell them what happened, they can help you. They start suggesting scenarios, feeding you details about the crime, details only the killer could know. And eventually, worn down and terrified, you start telling them what you think they want to hear. This nightmare became a reality for 20-year-old Christopher Tapp. In 1996, an 18-year-old woman named Angie Dodge was brutally murdered in her Idaho Falls apartment. The police were under huge pressure to solve the case. They brought Tapp in for questioning, and over a series of intense, psychologically manipulative interrogations, They squeezed a confession out of him. That confession was full of inconsistencies. Tapp's DNA didn't match the semen left at the scene. There wasn't a shred of physical evidence linking him to the murder. But in the courtroom, that confession was presented as irrefutable proof of guilt. And for a jury, it's almost impossible to believe that a person would confess to a crime they didn't commit. Yet, false confessions are a disturbingly common factor in wrongful convictions, contributing to about 29% of DNA exoneration cases. These confessions are often the product of coercive interrogation techniques, especially when used on young people or those with mental disabilities, who are far more susceptible to pressure. Christopher Tapp was convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to 30 years to life. For 2 decades, he was just another innocent man lost in the system. But one person never gave up hope of finding the real killer, Angie Dodge's own mother Carol. For years, she pushed for more advanced DNA testing on the evidence, convinced that other people were involved. Her relentless hunt for the truth led her to the Idaho Innocence Project, and eventually to a groundbreaking investigative technique called genetic genealogy. Investigators used public genealogy databases to trace the family tree of the unknown man whose DNA was found at the crime scene. In 2019, that search led them to a man named Brian Drips. When confronted by police, Drips, who had been the victim's neighbor, confessed to the murder. He had acted alone. It was the final, irrefutable proof. Christopher Tapp's confession was false. On July 17, 2019, after spending 20 years behind bars for something he had nothing to do with, he was fully exonerated. "It's a new life, a new beginning, a new world for me," he said. "And I'm just gonna enjoy every day." His case was the first time genetic genealogy was used not just to catch a killer, but to free an innocent man. Sometimes, the thing that sends an innocent person to prison isn't a faulty memory or a coerced confession. Sometimes, it's the evidence itself, or rather, what a jury is told is evidence. This brings us to the disturbing world of junk science. For decades, forensic techniques that have never been scientifically validated have been presented in court as near certain proof of guilt. And one of the most notorious of these is bite mark analysis. The theory sounds plausible. Just like fingerprints, our teeth are unique, so a bite mark on a victim's skin can be matched to one person. There's just one problem: it isn't true. The National Academy of Sciences has stated there is no evidence of an existing scientific basis for identifying an individual to the exclusion of all others through bite marks. Skin is malleable, it stretches and distorts, and different teeth can create very similar marks. Yet, this flawed technique has contributed to at least 35 known wrongful convictions and indictments. One of those belongs to Kennedy Brewer. In 1992, his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter was found murdered in Noxubee County, Mississippi. During the investigation, so-called forensic experts claimed that marks on the child's body were bite marks, and that they were a match to Brewer's teeth. One expert even testified with reasonable medical certainty that Brewer's teeth made the marks. Based almost entirely on this now discredited bite mark evidence, Kennedy Brewer was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to death. He spent the next 7 years on death row, as the state prepared to execute him for a crime he swore he didn't commit. The Innocence Project took on his case and pushed for DNA testing on biological evidence found on the victim's body. In 2001, the results came back. The DNA did not match Kennedy Brewer. He was excluded. But that wasn't all. The DNA profile was run through a database and matched another man, Justin Albert Johnson. When confronted, Johnson confessed not only to this crime, but to a separate, similar murder. For that crime, another innocent man, Levon Brooks, had also been convicted, based on the very same expert's bite mark testimony. The work of one so-called expert helped put 2 innocent men in prison. Even with this overwhelming new evidence, Kennedy Brewer wasn't immediately freed. Prosecutors intended to retry him, and he spent 5 more years in jail waiting. Finally, on February 15, 2008, after 15 years of wrongful imprisonment, the charges were dropped and he was fully exonerated. He was the first person in Mississippi to be cleared by post-conviction DNA testing. His case is a chilling reminder that in a courtroom, the word science doesn't always mean truth. Our system of justice is built on trust. We trust that police are searching for the truth and that prosecutors are pursuing justice. But what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when officials, through carelessness or deliberate action, are only focused on getting a conviction, no matter the cost? This is official misconduct, and it's a factor in more than half of all known wrongful convictions. It can take many forms: hiding evidence that points to innocence, fabricating evidence, coercing witnesses, or knowingly using false testimony. It's a rot at the foundation of the system, and it was at the center of the case of John Cogut. In 1985, John Cogut was convicted for the horrific murder of a 16-year-old girl in Long Island, New York. The case against him was built on two crumbling pillars. The first was a confession he gave after 18 hours of grueling, coercive interrogation, a confession he immediately took back. The second was the testimony of jailhouse informants, so-called snitches, who claimed Cogut had confessed to them. This type of testimony is notoriously unreliable. Informants are often given incentives to lie, like reduced sentences or other benefits, a fact that isn't always disclosed to the jury. In Cogut's case, the one-two punch of his coerced confession and the informant's testimony was enough to send him to prison for life. He spent 18 years fighting to prove his innocence. His lawyers argued the confession was forced and the informants were liars. But his appeals went nowhere. Finally, in 2003, a judge granted a request for DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene. The results were definitive. The DNA did not match John Cogut. It also didn't match the two other men implicated by his coerced confession. Faced with this powerful new evidence, the original conviction was thrown out. But the district attorney's office wasn't ready to give up. In an astonishing move, they decided to retry him, arguing that the confession was still valid, despite the DNA proof. They were prepared to ask a new jury to believe that Cogut had been at the murder, but had somehow managed not to leave a single trace of his DNA. In 2005, John Cogut went on trial for a second time. This time, his defense team was armed with the DNA evidence. They showed the jury not only that his DNA wasn't there, but that the entire case had been built on police pressure and untrustworthy testimony. After just a few hours, the jury came back with a verdict: not guilty. After 2 decades of proclaiming his innocence, John Cogut was finally free. His case is a stark warning of how official misconduct can create a wrongful conviction out of thin air, and how even DNA evidence can struggle to tear it down. For some, the fight for freedom is a marathon that spans almost an entire lifetime. Our final story is one of unimaginable endurance, and of a system that failed a man for nearly 4 decades. In 1975, a businessman named Harold Franks was murdered outside a convenience store in Cleveland, Ohio. Police, desperate to close the case, zeroed in on 3 young men: Ricky Jackson, who was 18, and 2 brothers, Wiley and Ronnie Bridgman. There was no physical evidence connecting them to the crime. No murder weapon was ever found. All 3 had alibis. The state's entire case rested on the testimony of one person, a 12-year-old boy named Eddie Vernon. Vernon told police he saw the attack and identified the 3 men. Based on the word of a child, all 3 were convicted and sentenced to death. Their sentences were later changed to life in prison only when Ohio's death penalty was found unconstitutional. Ricky Jackson would spend the next 39 years, 3 months, and 9 days in prison. At the time of his release, it was the longest wrongful imprisonment of any ex-Neri in American history. He maintained his innocence from day one. He even refused parole opportunities because they would have required him to admit guilt for a crime he didn't commit. Year after year, decade after decade, he held on to the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was that the state's star witness had lied. Eddie Vernon, the 12-year-old boy, wasn't even at the scene of the crime. He was on a school bus several blocks away. He later revealed that police had coerced him, feeding him details and pressuring him to stick to a story they helped create. For 39 years, Eddie Vernon carried this devastating secret. Finally, in 2013, prompted by his pastor, he came forward and told the truth. He recanted his entire testimony, admitting he had lied and put 3 innocent men in prison. At a court hearing in 2014, Vernon faced Ricky Jackson and, through tears, apologized for the life he had stolen. The prosecutor's office dropped all charges. Judge Richard McMonigal, in throwing out the conviction, said simply, "The state is conceding the obvious." On November 21, 2014, Ricky Jackson walked out of the courthouse a free man. While DNA wasn't the main tool that freed him, the case is a profound example of how modern forensic principles expose the flaws of the past. A case like this, built only on coerced testimony with no physical evidence, would face immense scrutiny today. In the DNA era, The complete absence of scientific proof can become its own form of evidence. 5 stories. 5 lives stolen. Ronald Cotton, Christopher Tapp, Kennedy Brewer, John Cogut, and Ricky Jackson. Together, they spent a combined 102.5 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. Their cases are not isolated glitches. They are symptoms of a deeply flawed system. They reveal the devastating impact of the leading causes of wrongful convictions, the fallibility of eyewitnesses, the danger of coerced confessions, the deception of junk science, and the profound betrayal of official misconduct. The development of DNA technology was a seismic event for criminal justice. It hasn't only been a tool to free the innocent, it has also identified over 180 real perpetrators, who in many cases went on to commit more violent crimes while an innocent person sat in their place. It has served as a kind of truth serum, exposing weaknesses in our justice system that have persisted for decades. But DNA isn't a magic bullet. Evidence can be lost or destroyed, and it's only present in a fraction of criminal cases. The real solution isn't just fixing past mistakes, but preventing future ones. That means implementing reforms like double-blind eyewitness lineups, recording all police interrogations, demanding scientific validation for forensic methods used in court, and holding officials accountable when they break the rules. The fight for a better system is far from over. The exonerations you've seen tonight don't just happen. They're often the result of decades of tireless work by nonprofit organizations. Groups like the Innocence Project work to exonerate the wrongfully convicted through DNA testing and push for reforms to prevent future injustices. But the fight for justice doesn't end when the prison gates open. These men and women re-enter society with nothing, facing immense challenges as they try to rebuild lives that were stolen from them. If you were moved by these stories and want to learn more about the causes of wrongful convictions, and support the work being done to free innocent people, please visit the website of the Innocence Project and other similar organizations. Share this video. The more people who understand these issues, the greater the demand for a more just and reliable criminal justice system for everyone. The human cost of these errors is immeasurable. We owe it to these 5 men, and the thousands more affected, to not just remember their stories, but to learn from them. To demand a system that truly values truth above all else. Because justice should never be a matter of luck.